Picture this. Someone in your group is gone. Not lost, not hunting, gone. You watched it happen. Maybe it was slow, a fever that burned for days. Maybe it was fast, a hunt that went wrong. Either way, the person who sat across the fire from you every night, the one whose breathing you fell asleep to, whose face you knew better than your own reflection, is now just a body. And you have no word for what you're feeling. No ritual handed down from a church. No funeral home. No grief counselor. No culture that has ever told you what to do next. Just a group of people standing around a body, feeling something so enormous it has no name yet. And what they did next changed what it means to be human. We tend to think of grief as a modern problem, something we manage with therapy and time off work and carefully worded text messages. But grief is not modern. Grief is ancient, and the evidence for it is written in red ochre on bones that are 100,000 years old. Today we're going back to the beginning, not of death. Death was always there, but of what humans did about it. The first thing you need to understand is that for most of human history, death was not a private event. It happened in front of everyone. In a group of 20 to 30 people living in close quarters, there was no such thing as dying alone in a hospital room. You died where you lived, in the cave, at the fire, surrounded by the people who depended on you and who you depended on. And that proximity changed everything about how death was experienced. When a member of the group died, the loss was not just emotional, it was structural. That person knew things. Which plants caused fever, where the river ran shallow enough to cross in summer, how to read the sky before a storm. Knowledge that existed nowhere except inside that person's head was now gone forever. So the group grieved on two levels at once. The personal, the loss of someone they knew and loved, and the practical, the loss of everything that person carried. And here's where the story gets complicated in ways that most people never hear about, because the archaeological record shows something that took scientists a long time to accept. Ancient humans didn't just discard their dead, they treated them with intention, and that intention is one of the most profound things we have ever found in the ground. The oldest known deliberate burial sites go back roughly 100,000 years. At Skhul Cave and Kafsa Cave in Israel, archaeologists found human remains that were clearly placed, not scattered, not abandoned, placed. Bodies arranged in specific positions, grave goods tucked alongside them. At Skhul, one individual was buried holding the jaw of a wild boar, not dropped there by accident, held, positioned, chosen. Think about what that means. Someone picked up that jaw, placed it in the hands of the dead, and covered them. That is not instinct. That is meaning. That is someone trying to send another person somewhere with something they might need. And then there's the ochre. Red ochre, iron oxide ground into powder, shows up at burial sites across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East going back tens of thousands of years. Bodies dusted in it. Bones stained so deeply the color survived for 100 millennia. We don't know exactly what it meant, but we know it meant something. Red is the color of blood, of life, of fire. Covering a body in red might have been a way of giving life back symbolically, of refusing, even for a moment, to accept that the warmth was gone. At Border Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found the remains of an infant buried with a perforated shell, the kind worn as jewelry. The baby was less than a year old. Someone buried their child and placed an ornament beside them, not for practical reasons, not for survival, for something else entirely, something that feels across 74,000 years completely recognizable. And then there are the Neanderthals. For decades, scientists debated whether Neanderthals actually buried their dead with intention, or whether the arrangements found at sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq were coincidental. The Shanidar Cave findings became famous because pollen samples found near one burial suggested flowers had been placed on the body. Wildflowers laid on a Neanderthal grave 60,000 years ago. Some researchers later argued the pollen may have been carried in by burrowing animals. The debate continues, but here's what's harder to argue with. At La Ferrisaille in France, 8 Neanderthal individuals, men, women, and children, were found buried in the same location, some with stone tools placed near them. At Régordeau in France, a Neanderthal was buried alongside a brown bear, the bones deliberately arranged. These are not accidents. These are choices, and choices imply something happening inside the mind that goes beyond simple animal response to death. Because animals respond to death too. Elephants return to the bones of their dead and touch them with their trunks. Chimpanzees have been observed carrying dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, unable or unwilling to let go. Crows hold what researchers describe as funeral gatherings around their dead. But what humans did was different in one specific way. We didn't just respond to death. We tried to do something about it. We tried to intervene, to prepare the dead for something, to mark them as having mattered. And that impulse, that refusal to simply leave, is the thing that separates human grief from every other kind. Now here's the part that stops people cold when they really think about it. Burial implies belief, not necessarily religion as we understand it, not churches or gods or scripture, but something, a sense that what happened to a body after death was not nothing, that it was worth doing something about, that the person who had just died was still, in some sense, a person. The grave goods tell us this more clearly than anything else. At Sunghir in Russia, dating to roughly 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found 3 burials that are among the most extraordinary ever discovered. An older man buried with thousands of individually drilled mammoth ivory beads sewn into his clothing. 2 children buried head to head, covered in even more beads, fox teeth, carved ivory, 2 massive straightened mammoth tusks laid alongside their bodies. The beads alone represent thousands of hours of work. Someone spent weeks, possibly months, making the clothing and ornamentation that these people were buried in. That is not grief in passing. That is grief as a project, grief as devotion, grief as a statement that these lives mattered so much that they deserved the most elaborate send-off the group could produce. And here's something that almost never gets discussed: the physical cost of that grief. In a world where every hour of labor was survival, spending weeks making burial beads was not a small thing. It meant not making tools, not preparing food, not tending the fire. The group absorbed that cost together, which tells us that by 34,000 years ago, humans had already decided that honoring the dead was worth the price of the living. That is a profound moral statement, one that most people today would recognize immediately. And then there is the question of what happened to the knowledge. Because in a world without writing, the death of a person wasn't just emotional loss, it was informational catastrophe. The oldest hunter in the group carried decades of accumulated knowledge about the land, the animals, the weather, the plants. When they died, all of that went with them unless it had already been passed on. This might be part of why the fireside stories mattered so much. The information had to live in people, passed mouth to ear, story by story before death could take it. And grief itself, the ritual of gathering, of sitting together, of speaking the name of the dead out loud, may have been one of the primary mechanisms for that transfer. You honor someone by telling their stories, and in telling their stories, you keep what they knew alive. So what did ancient humans do when someone they loved died? They buried them, they placed objects beside them, they covered them in red, they made them clothing they would never wear and jewelry they would never see. They spent weeks in labor for someone who could no longer benefit from it. They gathered together and almost certainly they spoke and cried and sat in the specific silence that comes after loss. That silence that feels like a physical presence in the room. That silence that has no name in any modern language, but that every human being throughout all of history has sat inside of at least once. Grief is not a modern invention. It is not a weakness or a malfunction. It is one of the oldest things we do. Older than language, older than agriculture, older than every civilization that has ever risen and fallen on this planet. The ochre on those bones has been there for 100,000 years. The love that put it there is older than that.